Chapter 1 of Beyond the Rocks, a love story. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Amy Deutschler. Beyond the Rocks, a love story by Eleanor Glynn. Chapter 1. The hours were composed mostly of dull or rebellious moments during the period of Theodora's engagement to Mr. Brown. From the very first, she had thought it hard that she should have had to take this situation, instead of Sarah or Clementine, her elder stepsisters, so much nearer his age than herself. To do them justice, either of these ladies would have been glad to relieve her of the obligation to become Mrs. Brown, but Mr. Brown thought otherwise. A young and beautiful wife was what he bargained for. To enter a family composed of 3 girls, 2 of the first family, one almost 30, and a second very plain, a father with a habit of accumulating debts and obliged to live at Bruges and inexpensive foreign seaside towns, required a strong motive. And this Josiah Brown found in the deliciously rounded white velvet cheek of Theodora, the 3rd daughter, to say nothing of her slender grace, the grace of a young fawn, and a pair of gentian blue eyes that said things to people in the first glance. Poor, foolish, handsome Dominic Fitzgerald, light-hearted, debonair Irish gentleman, gay and gallant on his miserable pension of a broken and retired guardsman, had had just sufficient sense to insist upon magnificent settlements, certainly prompted thereto by Clementine, who inherited the hard-headedness of the early defunct Scotch mother, as well as her high cheekbones. That affair had been a youthful mésalliance. "You had better see we all gain something by it, Papa," she had said. "Make the old bore give Theodora a huge allowance, and have it all fixed and settled by law beforehand. She is such a fool about money, just like you. She will shower it upon us, and you make him pay you a sum down as well." Captain Fitzgerald fortunately consulted an honest solicitor, and so things were arranged to the satisfaction of all parties concerned, except Theodora herself, who found the whole affair far from her taste. That one must marry a rich man if one got the chance to help poor, darling Papa had always been part of her creed, more or less inspired by Papa himself. But when it came to the scratch and Josiah Brown was offered as a husband, Theodora had had to use every bit of her nerve and self-control to prevent herself from refusing. She had not seen many men in her 19 years of out-at-elbows life, but she had imagination, and the 1 or 2 peeps at smart old friends of Papa's, landed from stray yachts now and then at out-of-the-way French watering places, had given her an ideal far, far removed from the personality of Josiah Brown. But, as Sarah explained to her, such men could never be husbands. They might be lovers if one was fortunate enough to move in their sphere, but husbands never, and there was no use Theodora protesting this violent devotion to darling Papa if she could not do a small thing like marrying Josiah Brown for him. Theodora's beautiful mother, dead in the first year of her runaway marriage, had been the daughter of a stiff-necked, unforgiving old earl. She had bequeathed her child, besides these gentian eyes and wonderful silvery blonde hair, a warm, generous heart, and more or less romantic temperament. The heart was touched by darling Papa's needs, and the romantic temperament revolted by Josiah Brown's personality. However, there it was. The marriage took place at the consulate Dieppe, and a perfectly miserable little bride got into the train for Paris, accompanied by a fat, short, prosperous, middle-class English husband, who had accumulated a large fortune in Australia quite by accident in a comparatively few years. Josiah Brown was only 52, though his head was bald and his figure far from slight. He had a liver, a chest, and a temper, and he adored Theodora. Captain Fitzgerald had felt a few qualms when he had wished his little daughter goodbye on the platform and had seen the blue stars swimming with tears. The 2 daughters left to him were so plain, and he hated plain people about him. But, on the other hand, women must marry, and what chance had he, poor, unlucky devil, of establishing his Theodora better in life? Josiah Brown was a good fellow, and he, Dominic Fitzgerald, had for the first time for many years a comfortable balance at his banker's, and could run up to Paris himself in a few days. And who knows, the American widow, fabulously rich Jane Anastasia McBride, might take him seriously. Captain Dominic Fitzgerald was irresistible, and had that fortunate knack of looking like a gentleman in the oldest clothes. If married for the 3rd time, but this time prosperously, to a fabulously rich American, his well-born relations would once more welcome him with open arms, he felt sure, and visions of the best pheasant shoots at Old Beachley and partridge drives at Ruthering Castle floated before his eyes, quite obscuring the fading smoke of the Paris train. A pretty tough, dull affair, marriage, he said to himself, reminded once more of Theodora by treading on a white rose in the station. Hope to heaven Sarah prepared her for it a bit. Then he got into a fiacre and drove to the hotel, where he and the 2 remaining Mrs. Fitzgerald were living in the style of their forefathers. Josiah Brown's valet, Mr. Toplington, who knew the world, had engaged rooms for the happy couple at the Grand Hotel. We'll go to the Ritz on our way back, he decided. But at first, in case there's scenes and tears, it's better to be a number than a name. Mademoiselle Henriette, the freshly engaged French maid, quite agreed with him. The Grand, she said, was plus convenable pour une lune de miel. A lune de miel. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Beyond the Rocks, a love story by Eleanor Glynn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Amy Deutschler. It was a year later before Theodora saw her family again. A very severe attack of bronchitis complicated by internal catarrh prostrated Josiah Brown in the first days of their marriage, and had turned her into a superintendent nurse for the next 3 months. By that time, a winter at Hyères was recommended by the best physicians, and off they started. Hyères, with a semi-invalid, a hospital nurse, and quantities of medicine bottles and draught protectors, is not the ideal place one reads of in guidebooks. Theodora grew to hate the sky and the blue Mediterranean. She used to sit on her balcony at Costebelle and gaze at the olive trees and the deep green velvet patch of firs beyond towards the sea and wonder at life. She longed to go to the islands, anywhere beyond, and one day she read Jean de Grève, and after that she wondered what love was. It took a mighty hold upon her imagination. It seemed to her it must mean life. It was the beginning of May before Josiah Brown thought of leaving for Paris. England would be their destination, but the doctors assured him a month of Paris would break the change of climate with more safety than if they crossed the Channel at once. Costebelle was a fairyland of roses as they drove to the station, and peace had descended upon Theodora. She had fallen into her place, a place occupied by many wives before her with irritable, hypochondriacal husbands. She had often been to Paris in her maiden days. She knew it from the point of view of a cheap boarding house and snatched meals. But the unchecked gaiety of the air and the façon had not been tarnished by that. She had played in the Tuileries Gardens and watched Ponchinello at the Rond Point, and later been taken once or twice to dine at a cheap café in the Bois by Papa. And once she had gone to Robinson on a coach with him and some aristocratic acquaintances of his, and eaten luncheon up the tree, and that was a day of the gods and to be remembered. But now they were going to an expensive, well-managed private hotel in the Avenue du Bois, suitable to invalids, and it poured with rain as they drove from the Gare de Lyon. All this time something in Theodora was developing. Her beautiful face had an air of dignity. The set of her little Greek head would have driven a sculptor wild. and Josiah Brown was very generous in money matters, and she had always known how to wear her clothes, so it was no wonder people stopped and turned their heads when she passed. Josiah Brown possessed certainly not less than $40,000 a year, and so he felt he could afford a carriage in Paris, and any other fancy he pleased. His nerves had been too shaken by his illness to appreciate the joys of an automobile. Thus, daily might be seen in the Avenue des Acacias this ill-sorted pair, seated in a smart Victoria with stepping horses, driving slowly up and down, and a number of people took an interest in them. Towards the middle of May, Captain Fitzgerald arrived at the Continental, and Theodora felt her heart beat with joy when she saw his handsome, well-groomed head. Oh yes, it had been indeed worthwhile to make Papa look so prosperous as that. So prosperous and happy. Dear, gay Papa. He was about the same age as her husband, but no one would think of taking him for more than 40. And what a figure he had! And what manners! And when he patted her cheek, Theodora felt at once that thrill of pride and gratification she had always experienced when he was pleased with her from her youngest days. She was almost glad Sarah and Clementine should have remained at Dieppe. Thus she could have Papa all to herself, and oh, what presents she would send them back by him when he returned! Josiah Brown despised Dominic Fitzgerald, and yet stood in awe of him as well. A man who could spend a fortune and be content to live on odds and ends for the rest of his life must be a poor creature. But, on the other hand, there was that uncomfortable sense of breeding about him which once, when Captain Fitzgerald had risen to a situation of dignity during their preliminary conversations about Theodora's hand, had made Josiah Brown unconsciously say, "Sir," to him. He had blushed and bitten his tongue for doing it, and had blustered and patronized immoderately afterwards, but he never forgot the incident. They were not birds of a feather, and never would be, though the exquisite manners of Dominic Fitzgerald could carry any situation. Josiah was not altogether pleased to see his father-in-law. He even experienced a little jealousy. Theodora's face, which generally wore a mask of gentle, solicitous meekness for him, suddenly sparkled and rippled with laughter as she pinched her papa's ears and pulled his mustache and purred into his neck with joy at their meeting. It was that purring sound and those caressing tricks that Josiah Brown objected to. He had never received any of them himself, and so why should Dominic Fitzgerald? Captain Fitzgerald, for his part, was enchanted to clasp his beautiful daughter once more in his arms. He had always loved Theodora, and when he saw her so quite too desirable looking in her exquisite clothes, he felt a very fine fellow himself, thinking what he had done for her. It was not an unnatural circumstance that he should look upon the idea of a dinner at the respectable private hotel with his son-in-law and daughter as a trifle dull for Paris, or that he should have suggested a meal at the Ritz would do them both good. "Come and dine with me instead, my dear child," he said, with his grand air. "Josiah, you must begin to go out a little and shake off your illness, my dear fellow." But Josiah was peevish. Not tonight, certainly not tonight. It was the evening he was to take the 2 doses of his new medicine, one half an hour after the other, and he could not leave the hotel. Then he saw how poor Theodora's face fell, and one of his sparks of consideration for the feelings of others came to him, and he announced gruffly that his wife might go with her father if she pleased, provided she crept into her room, which was next door to his own, without the least noise on her return. "I must not be disturbed in my first sleep," he said, and Theodora thanked him rapturously. It was so good of him to let her go. She would indeed make not the least noise, and she danced out of the room to get ready in a way Josiah Brown had never seen her do before. And after she had gone, Captain Fitzgerald came back to fetch her. This fact rankled with him and prevented his sleep for more than 20 minutes. "My sweet child," said Captain Fitzgerald, when he was seated beside his daughter in her brougham rolling down the Champs-Élysées. "You must not be so grateful. He won't let you out again if you are." "Oh, Papa," said Theodora. They arrived at the Ritz just at the right moment. It was a lovely night, but rather cold, so there were no diners in the garden, and the crowd from the restaurant extended even into the hall. It was an immense satisfaction to Dominic Fitzgerald to walk through them all with this singularly beautiful young woman, and to remark the effect she produced, and his cup of happiness was full when they came upon a party at the lower end by the door, prominent as hostess being Jane Anastasia McBride, the fabulously rich American widow. In a second of time he reviewed the situation. A faint coldness in his manner would be the thing to draw, and it was, for when he had greeted Mrs. McBride without gush, and presented his daughter with the air of just passing on, the widow implored them with great cordiality to leave their solitary meal and join her party, nor would she hear of any refusal. The whole scene was so novel and delightful to Theodora she cared not at all whether her father accepted or no, so long as she might sit quietly and observe the world. Mrs. McBride had perceived immediately that the string of pearls round Mrs. Josiah Brown's neck could not have cost less than £9,000, and that her frock, although so simple, was the last and most expensive creation of Calaussure. She had always been horribly attracted by Captain Fitzgerald, ever since that race week at Trouville 2 summers ago, and fate had sent them here tonight, and she meant to enjoy herself. Captain Fitzgerald acceded to her request with his usual polished ease, and the radiant widow presented the rest of her guests to the 2 newcomers. The tall man with a fierce beard was Prince Worzoff, married to her niece, Sadie Boucher. Sadie Boucher was short and had a voice you could hear across the room. The sleek, fair youth with the twinkling gray eyes was an Englishman from the embassy. The disagreeable-looking woman in the badly made mauve silk was his sister, Lady Hilden. The stout, hook-nosed bird of prey with the heavy gold chain was a Western millionaire, and the smiling girl was his daughter. Then, last of all, came Lord Bracondale, and it was when he was presented that Theodora first began to take an interest in the party. Hector, 14th Lord Bracondale of Bracondale, as she later that night read in the peerage, was aged 31 years. He had been educated at Eton and Oxford, served for some time in the 4th Life Guards, had been unpaid attaché at St. Petersburg, was patron of 5 livings, and sat in the House of Lords as Baron Bracondale, creation 1505, seat Bracondale Chase, brothers none, sister living, and Charlotte, married to the 4th Earl of Anningford. Theodora read all this over twice, and also even the predecessors and collateral branches, but that was while she burned the midnight oil and listened to the snorts and coughs of Josiah Brown slumbering next door. For the time being she raised her eyes and looked into Lord Bracondale's, and something told her they were the nicest eyes she had ever seen in this world. Then when a voluble French count had rushed up with garrulous apologies for being late, the party was complete, and they swept into the restaurant. Theodora sat between the Western millionaire and the Russian prince, but beyond, it was a round table, only just big enough to hold them, came her hostess and Lord Bracondale, and 2 or 3 times at dinner they spoke, and very often she felt his eyes fixed upon her. Mrs. McBride, like all American widows, was an admirable hostess. The conversation never flagged or the gaiety for one moment. The Western millionaire was shrewd and announced some quaint truths while he picked his teeth with an audible sound. "This is his first visit to Europe," Princess Worzoff said afterwards to Theodora by way of explanation. "He is so colossally rich he don't need to worry about such things at his time of life, but it does make me turn to hear him." Captain Fitzgerald was in his element. No guest shone so brilliantly as he. His wit was delicate, his sallies were daring, his looks were insinuating, and his appearance was perfection. Theodora had every reason to tingle with pride in him, and the widow felt her heart beat. "Isn't he just too bright, your father, Mrs. Brown?" she said as they left the restaurant to have their coffee in the hall. "You must let me see quantities of you while we are all in Paris together. It is a lovely city. Don't you agree with me?" And Theodora did. Lord Bracondale was of the same breed as Captain Fitzgerald. That is, they neither of them permitted themselves to be superseded by any other man with the object of their wishes. When they wanted to talk to a woman, they did, if 20 French counts or Russian princes stood in the way. Thus it was that, for the rest of the evening, Theodora found herself seated upon a sofa in close proximity to the man who had interested her at dinner, and Mrs. McBride and Captain Fitzgerald occupied 2 armchairs equally well placed, while the rest of the party made general conversation. Hector Bracondale, among other attractions, had a charming voice. It was deep and arresting, and he had a way of looking straight into the eyes of the person he was talking to. Theodora knew at once he belonged to the tribe whom Sarah had told her could never be husbands. She wondered vaguely why, all the time she was talking to him. Why had husbands always to be bores and unattractive, and sometimes even simply revolting like hers? Was it because these beautiful creatures could not be bound to any one woman? It seemed to her unsophisticated mind that it could be very nice to be married to one of them, but there was no use fighting against fate, and she personally was wedded to Josiah Brown. Lord Bracondale's conversation pleased her. He seemed to understand exactly what she wanted to talk about. He saw all the things she saw, and he had read Jean de Grève, and they got to that at the end of the first half hour, and then she froze up a little. Some instinct told her it was dangerous ground, so she spoke suddenly of the weather in a banal voice. Meanwhile, from the beginning of dinner, Lord Bracondale had been saying to himself she was the loveliest white flower he had yet struck in a path of varied experiences. Her eyes, so innocent and true, with the tender expression of a fawn, the perfect turn of her head and slender pillar of a throat, her grace and gentleness all appealed to him in a maddening way. "She is asleep to the whole of life's possibilities," he thought. "What can her husband be about? And what an intoxicatingly agreeable task to wake her up!" He had lived among the world where the awakening of young wives, or old wives, or any woman who could please man was the natural course of the day. It never even struck him that it might be a cruel thing to do. A woman once married was always fair game. If the husband could not retain her affections, that was his lookout. Hector Bracondale was not a brute, just an ordinary Englishman of the world, who had lived and loved and seen many lands. He read Theodora like an open book. He knew exactly why she had talked about the weather after Jean de Grève. It thrilled him to see her soft eyes dreamy and luminous when they first spoke of the book, and it flattered him when she changed the conversation. As for Theodora, she analyzed nothing. She only felt that perhaps she ought not to speak about love to one of those people who could never be husbands. Captain Fitzgerald, meanwhile, was making tremendous headway with the widow. He flattered her vanity, he entertained her intelligence, and he even ended by letting her see she was causing him personally great emotion. At last, this promising evening came to an end. The Russian prince with his American princess got up to say good night, and gradually the party broke up, but not before Captain Fitzgerald had arranged to meet Mrs. McBride at Doucet's in the morning, and give her the benefit of his taste and experience in a further shopping expedition to buy old bronzes. "We can all breakfast together at Henry's," he said, with his grand manner, which included the whole party, and for one instant force of habit made Theodora's heart sink with fear at the prospect of the bill, as it had often had to do in olden days when her father gave these royal invitations. Then she remembered she had not been sacrificed to Josiah Brown for nothing, and that even if dear, generous Papa should happen to be a little hard up again, a few 100 francs would be nothing to her to slip into his hand before starting. The rest of the party, however, declined. They were all busy elsewhere except Lord Bracondale and the French Count. They would come with pleasure, they said. Theodora wondered what Josiah would say. Would he go? And if not, would he let her go? This was more important. "Then we shall meet at breakfast tomorrow," Lord Bracondale said, as he helped her on with her cloak. "That will give me something to look forward to." "Will it?" she said, and there was trouble in the 2 blue stars which looked up at him. "Perhaps I shall not be able to come. My husband is rather an invalid and—" But he interrupted her. "Something tells me you will come. It is fate," he said, and his voice was grave and tender. And Theodora, who had never before had the opportunity of talking about destiny and other agreeable subjects with beautiful Englishmen who could only be lovers, felt the red blood rush to her cheeks and a thrill flutter her heart. So she quickened her steps and kept close to her father, who could have dispensed with this mark of affection. "Dearest child," he said when they were seated in the brougham, "you are married now and should be able to look after yourself, without staying glued to my side so much. It is rather bourgeois." Poor Theodora was crushed and did not try to excuse herself. "I am afraid Josiah won't go, Papa dear," she said timidly. "And in case he does not allow me to either, I want you to have these few louis, just for the breakfast. I know how generous you are and how difficult things have been made for you, darling." And she nestled to his side and slipped about 8 gold pieces, which she had fortunately found in her purse, into his hand. Captain Fitzgerald was still a gentleman, although a good many edges of his sensitive perceptions had been rubbed off. He kissed his daughter fondly while he murmured, "Merely alone, my pet, merely alone. You were always a jewel to your old father." Whenever her parent accused himself of being old, Theodora knew he was deeply touched, and her tender heart overflowed with gladness that she was able to smooth the path of such a darling papa. "I will come and see you in the morning, my child," he said, as they stopped at the door of her hotel, "and I will manage Josiah." So Theodora crept up to her apartment comforted, and in the salon it was she caught the sight of the peerage. Josiah Brown bought one every year and traveled with it, although until he met the Fitzgerald family he had not known a single person connected with it, but it pleased him to be able to look up his wife's name and to read that her mother was the daughter of a real live earl and her father the brother of a baronet. "Hector, I like the name of Hector," were the last coherent thoughts which floated through the brain of Theodora before sleep closed her broad white lids. Meanwhile, Lord Bracondale had gone on to sup at the Café de Paris with Marianne de Beauvoisin and Esclarmonde de Chartres, and among the diamonds and pearls and scents and feathers he suddenly felt a burning disgust and a longing to be out again in the moonlight, alone with his thoughts. "Mais qu'est-ce tu, mon vieux chou?" they said. "Ce bel Hector chéri, il a un bégon pour quelqu'un, mais ce n'est pas pour nous autres." End of chapter 2.